Title: The Knocking Beyond the Cornfields. When I was 12, every night for close to 2 months, someone or something would knock on my bedroom window. It was usually between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., right when the world seemed at its quietest. At first, the knocks would jolt me awake from deep sleep. A few times, I even dreamt of the knocking, only to wake up and realize it was still happening. We lived on the outskirts of a small town called Riverbend in a modest 2-story house that backed up to a sprawling forest. The house was part of a new development, and there weren't any large trees close enough for branches to tap against the windows. The sound was unmistakably that of knuckles rapping on glass. My bedroom was at the far end of the second floor, facing the backyard and the dense woods beyond. At night, the only light came from a dim street lamp several houses down, and on darker nights, my world outside those windows was nothing but an inky abyss. I had a small nightlight, but no bedside lamp, so to see anything, I would have had to cross the room to flick on the overhead switch. My windows were covered by heavy curtains, but the idea of being bathed in light with someone or something out watching was too terrifying to even consider. After a week of enduring the nightly knocks, I nervously asked my younger brother, Will, if he had been playing a prank on me. He was 8 at the time, and when I mentioned the knocking, his face turned pale. He ran straight to our parents, scared out of his mind. This, of course, led to my parents confronting me, insisting I was making up stories. But I knew what I'd been hearing. The knocking continued, night after night, and my anxiety worsened. I became exhausted, barely able to focus in school. My teachers noticed, and one day, Miss Harper, my homeroom teacher, pulled me aside. I told her everything about the late-night knocking and how I couldn't sleep. She looked concerned and sent me to the principal's office. After a brief conversation, the principal called my mother, and they had a closed-door meeting. To this day, my mom refuses to tell me what they discussed. That night, my mom agreed to sleep in my room to prove that nothing was going on. I felt a sliver of relief as she settled on the spare trundle bed beside mine. But when I woke up to the familiar knocking at 1:30 a.m., I reached out to shake her, only to find she was gone. My heart stopped. I lay frozen in my bed as the knocking continued for what felt like an eternity. When it finally stopped, I slipped from my bed, dropped to the floor, and army crawled out of my room and down the hallway, terrified of what might be outside. I found my parents asleep on the living room couch, the television quietly humming in the background. Panic overwhelmed me, and I began scream-crying, waking them both up. My dad, frustrated and tired, grumbled, "Tomorrow, you and me will wait outside and we'll settle this." I half hoped he'd forget by morning, but he didn't. The next night, we dressed in dark clothes, him in his old hunting camouflage, and me in black sweatpants and a hoodie. We crouched between the back porch and the house, where we had a perfect view of both the edge of the forest and my bedroom window. A sliver of the moon provided just enough light to make out the shapes of trees and the outline of our house. I tried to stay alert, but soon I was lulled to sleep by the stillness. Around 4 a.m., my dad nudged me awake. He muttered that all he'd seen were a couple of deer grazing near the tree line, and maybe I had heard animals rustling around. Relieved and disappointed at the same time, we went back inside. But just minutes after lying down, I heard it. A thunderous bang, bang, bang on my window, so loud and violent it rattled the blinds. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding, paralyzed with fear. The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity, but when it finally stopped, it never returned. I told my parents about it the next morning, but they insisted it had to be my imagination. To this day, they believe the whole ordeal was a product of my overactive mind, but I know what I heard. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the sound of those knuckles on glass echoing into the night just beyond the edge of the dark woods. Title: The Fire in Grandma's Backyard. When I was in 4th grade, my mom and I moved to a small town a few hours away to live with my grandmother. I was an only child and painfully shy. At my old school, all my friends had known me forever, but in this new place, I had no idea how to connect with anyone. One day during recess, a girl named Lizzie approached me. She was confident and friendly, instantly making me feel at ease. From that day on, Lizzie became my best friend. We walked home from school together and hung out at my grandma's house until it was time for her to head home. My mom worked long hours, so my grandma was the one keeping an eye on us. But lately, Grandma had started acting strangely. Sometimes she'd call me by my mom's name. Other times, she'd accuse me of stealing things, even though I hadn't. To avoid her odd behavior, Lizzie and I spent most of our afternoons in the backyard. Sometimes I'd glance back at the house and catch Grandma watching us from the window, cigarette in hand, glaring. Lizzie told me stories about camping trips her family took in the nearby woods, something I had never experienced. I was fascinated. We spent hours pretending to hike, pitch tents, and fish in imaginary streams. In our little world, we were explorers, camping out in the wild. We even built a giant pile of sticks and leaves, pretending it was our campfire. One afternoon, as we passed through the living room on our way outside, Lizzie quietly grabbed my grandma's lighter from the table. She motioned for me to stay quiet, and for some reason, I didn't think to question her. In the backyard, Lizzie crouched by the pile of dry branches and flicked the lighter on. At first, the fire seemed small and harmless, barely catching on the twigs, but in an instant, it roared to life. Before I could process what was happening, the fire leaped from the pile and caught the side of the house. Lizzie dropped the lighter and ran. I just stood there, frozen in shock as flames engulfed the wall of the house. The next thing I remember is my grandma screaming and the wail of sirens. The fire department arrived quickly, and the house wasn't completely destroyed, but the damage was done. My mom was furious. Not long after, she decided I should move back with my dad, returning me to my old school. I was too ashamed to tell my friends what had happened, and no one ever asked me about Lizzie or the fire. Soon after I left, my grandma was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She grew worse over time, and my mom spent all her days taking care of her. I only saw Grandma once more before she passed away, but by then, she didn't know who I was. Years later, during a casual conversation, my mom mentioned how worried she had been about me not making friends when I was younger. I felt hurt by the comment. I did have a friend, I reminded her. Her name was Lizzie. Lizzie, my mom asked, confused. Who's Lizzie? I realized then that my mom had never actually met Lizzie. She wasn't in my class, but we spent every lunch and recess together, and she came to my house almost every day. I was sure Grandma must have mentioned her, or at least seen her through the window, but my mom insisted she'd never heard of Lizzie. In fact, at a parent-teacher conference, she was told I was always alone at school. I tried to think of some proof of Lizzie's existence, a photo, a note, anything, but there wasn't any. I remembered Lizzie always leaving in the same direction after our play dates, heading down the street toward what I thought was her house. But when I told my mom this, she shook her head. There aren't any houses down that way. That's just an industrial park. To this day, I don't know what to make of it. Lizzie felt so real. But now, looking back, I wonder if she ever really existed at all. Title: The Dark Figure in the Dorm. My freshman year of college, I lived in an all-women's dorm on a quiet street near the heart of a rural campus nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. The isolation of the school gave it a reputation for being incredibly safe, but from the moment we arrived, freshmen were warned about something else: ghosts. The campus was supposedly full of them. There were stories about a men's dorm where a room would trap people inside as an angry spirit pounded the walls, and a music building where students felt constantly watched during late-night practices. Our dorm had its own haunting, but my roommate, Claire, and I didn't know that when we moved in. About a month into the semester, I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. Groggy and half asleep, I glanced across the room at Claire. I could make out the faint silhouette of her sitting up rigidly in bed, staring at the door. Then I saw something, just a dark shape, near the doorway. I didn't think much of it at the time. We never locked our door, and it wasn't unusual for friends or other girls from our hall to wander in late at night, especially after a night out. Too tired to care, I mumbled something like, "Go away," and fell back asleep. The next morning, the memory of the night was hazy in my mind, but Claire was visibly shaken. She insisted on telling our RA about what had happened. That's when we learned the dorm's dark history. According to our RA, the building had once been a makeshift field hospital during the Civil War. Some students believed that at night the ghosts of fallen soldiers wandered the halls, knocking on doors as they searched for a way out. Neither of us fully believed the ghost story at first. I still thought it might have been a confused friend trying to find their room in the middle of the night, but it was undeniably thrilling to think we might have our very own ghost encounter. Our curiosity got the best of us, and we started listening more closely at night, even forming a ghost watch with some friends. We gathered stories from older students, and soon enough, we started noticing things. Strange rustling noises in the walls, knocks on doors at odd hours, and whispers that couldn't be explained. One friend claimed she saw a face reflected in the glass of her window, trapped as if trying to get in. As the weeks went on, the excitement gave way to a creeping fear. The strange occurrences weren't just part of the campus folklore anymore. They felt real. The knocks came more frequently, and every night we braced ourselves for what might happen next. We even brought it up to another RA, a skeptic who brushed us off, saying that older students enjoyed scaring freshmen with ghost stories. But Claire and I felt different. Something was there, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even as we slept. Then, one night, it happened again. I woke to a sound in the dark and immediately saw Claire, stiff as a board, sitting up in her bed. But this time, the shadow in the doorway was larger. It wasn't just standing by the door. It was closer, creeping toward the foot of my bed. My heart raced with fear. I sat up, filled with adrenaline, clenched my fists, and shouted, "Get the hell out!" For a brief moment, everything was still. And then, just like that, the shadow vanished. We both sat there, stunned. After what felt like an eternity, I jumped out of bed and flipped on the light while Claire scrambled to shut the door. We stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. Strangely, after that night, the shadow never appeared again. We joked that ghosts must respond to assertive cursing. It wasn't until a couple of weeks later that we learned the real story. Campus police had caught a prowler lurking outside another residence hall, peering into windows. It turned out that for weeks, students had been reporting strange noises, seeing faces outside their windows, and feeling like someone was watching them. The police had advised the dorm staff to warn students to lock their doors at night, but the RAs hadn't taken the threat seriously. They dismissed the reports, believing the campus was too safe for anything like that to happen. Claire and I realized the horrifying truth. The noises we had heard, the dark figure in the doorway, it wasn't a ghost. It was the prowler. For weeks, we had been living with a real threat, watching and waiting for the right moment to come inside. Title: The Last Ride. In the summer of 2010, I spent most of my time hitchhiking across the U.S. I had just graduated from college and wanted to take on a challenge, something unfamiliar and a bit risky. With everything I owned crammed into 2 large backpacks, one on my back, the other strapped to my front, I hit the road. I carried no tent, just a sleeping bag, a prepaid card for payphones, and only a few dollars in my pocket. No cell phone, no maps, and no watch. It was just me and the open road. That summer wasn't romantic or adventurous in the way I had imagined. Most of my days were spent waiting on the side of off-ramps, sweating under the relentless sun. The hours of isolation were hard, and the road's unpredictability quickly turned dangerous once I reached the deep south. Things started going sideways when I was picked up by a stripper in Oklahoma who took me to her boyfriend's house in Tulsa, a drug dealer. For 2 nerve-wracking hours, I pretended to be one of her classmates to keep from drawing suspicion. Later, in Georgia, a man with slurred speech told me he had just beaten his ex's new boyfriend half to death while driving over 100 miles per hour down I-85. My nights off the road were no better. Southern summers are no joke, especially when you're sweltering in a sleeping bag surrounded by mosquitoes. By October, I had had enough. I decided to head to New Orleans, where I'd already spent some time doing post-Katrina relief work. I wanted to hang up my hitchhiking boots for a while and find some stability. That evening, as I traveled south on I-59 in Mississippi, a driver dropped me off at the Purvis exit. The town was small, less than 2,000 people, and I could see nothing but fields and a lonely road stretching toward the town. Figuring I had enough daylight left, I stuck my thumb out again, hoping to catch one last ride into town before sunset. It wasn't long before a red pickup truck pulled over. The driver, let's call him Daryl, was also headed south for hurricane relief work in coastal Mississippi. He and his crew were contracted to pick up FEMA trailers and deliver them to the devastated coast. As we chatted, he offered me a job. $50 an hour, he said. Easy work, good money. I declined, telling him I was headed to New Orleans as a volunteer. Daryl scoffed at that, but kept pushing. Just work with me for a day, he insisted. See how you like it, then you can go on your way. I didn't want to argue with the man driving, so I reluctantly agreed. Soon after, he received a phone call. The weather had worsened on the coast, so Daryl decided to head back to Purvis for the night, planning to pick up the trailer the next morning. Whether I liked it or not, I was now part of his plans. As the night dragged on, Daryl's true nature began to emerge. His phone calls were troubling. He grumbled about one of his workers asking for money and mentioned another worker who had taken off on a stolen bike. Then on one call, he referred to me. Yeah, I picked up a new friend. Me and my buddy are heading back. It hit me then, I wasn't just a passenger anymore. Daryl had been picking up people and using them for labor without paying them. As his workers escaped or quit, he found new recruits. Suddenly, I felt the weight of the situation. Something was seriously wrong. By the time we pulled into Purvis, it was pitch dark. The town was eerily silent, with no streetlights or signs to guide us. Daryl pulled up to a gas station, its fluorescent lights flickering over a lone attendant at the counter. That's when things took an even darker turn. Without warning, Daryl called his girlfriend and started having phone sex while I was still sitting there. He made no effort to hide what he was doing, and as I sat there, the dread I had been feeling intensified. I had to get out. Now. The problem was, I had no idea where I was. The freeway was miles away, and outside the gas station's light, the world was black. But staying in that truck wasn't an option. I quietly muttered about needing to make a call and reached for my backpacks. Daryl's free hand slid over to my knee. "Why do you need all that for a phone call?" he asked. I mumbled something incoherent, dragging my packs with me into the gas station. I pretended to use the payphone, all the while glancing outside at Daryl, still engrossed in his call. My heart pounded as I considered my next move. I couldn't stay in the gas station forever, and if I didn't leave now, he'd be back to collect me. I shouldered my backpacks and crept toward the door. Then I ran. I bolted into the night, my packs banging against my body as I stumbled into the dark. Behind me, I heard him shout, "Hey!" But I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, veering off the road and into a ditch. I tossed my backpacks aside and dropped to the ground, lying flat in the mud, my heart racing. I couldn't see anything, but I heard the growl of an engine in the distance. Then it got louder. I froze as the headlights passed, the car roaring down the road. It could have been anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was him. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, breathing as quietly as possible. Minutes passed before I heard another car, this one moving slower. I ducked down again, holding my breath as it passed just feet away. My mind raced. If Daryl found me, what would I do? Eventually, the night quieted again. I waited for over an hour before finally standing up, gathering my packs, and walking toward the freeway. 2 more hours passed as I wandered through the dark, hiding whenever a car approached. By the time I found the freeway, it was still too early to hitchhike. I collapsed in a nearby clearing and waited for daylight, too scared to sleep. When the sun rose, I stuck my thumb out, my heart pounding at the thought that Daryl might be the one to pick me up. Hours passed before a different driver finally stopped. He took me all the way to New Orleans. I never hitchhiked again. Tash title, The Echo from the Lake. In the early 1980s, when I was a teenager, I attended a sleepaway summer camp in the remote wilderness of northern Vermont. Nestled deep in the Green Mountains, the camp was set on the shores of a tranquil, mist-covered lake, far removed from civilization. It took about 20 minutes by car to reach the nearest town, and once you crossed through the camp's entrance, you were completely disconnected. This was long before cell phones or the internet existed, so the camp truly was its own isolated world. For 8 weeks each summer, we were surrounded by nature, with no distractions from the outside world. It was a magical place for a kid. During the day, the camp buzzed with activity, swimming, hiking, boating, and crafting. But by night, the dark blanket of the forest closed in around us, and the lake transformed into an ominous black expanse. It was beautiful, sure, but also a bit eerie, as if something was always lurking just beneath the surface. Every summer, on the last night of camp, we gathered for a huge bonfire on the beach. The atmosphere was always bittersweet. People said tearful goodbyes, exchanged addresses, for snail mail, of course, and shared last moments with their summer crushes. The fire roared, lighting up our faces, and the crackle of wood mixed with the sounds of music blaring from boomboxes. Beyond the firelight, however, was a different world. Looking out over the lake at night, you couldn't see a thing. It was just a void of blackness stretching endlessly toward the forested hills on the far side. It was around 9 p.m. when it happened. We were all gathered, singing songs and goofing off, when suddenly a voice pierced the night. "Please, somebody help me," a man's voice screamed, clear and desperate. The sound came from the direction of the lake, and immediately, everything stopped. Every camper and counselor fell silent, eyes wide as they stared out toward the water. The fire crackled softly in the background, and in that moment, it seemed like the entire camp held its breath. One of the counselors pulled out a flashlight, shining it across the water's surface. The beam sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing. No boat, no swimmer, no ripple in the water. Just emptiness. Some of us nervously laughed, hoping it was some sort of elaborate prank, but something about the cry for help didn't feel right. We all heard it, and it was raw, filled with genuine panic. A few minutes passed, and everyone began to relax, talking quietly again and trying to shake off the fear. But then the voice came again, louder and closer this time. "Please, somebody help me," the man shouted, more frantic than before. Flashlights immediately swept the lake again, but still there was nothing. One of the head counselors, a tall, no-nonsense guy named Dave, stepped forward and shouted, "Where are you? We can't see you. Tell us what you need." His voice echoed across the water, but there was no answer. The tension was thick in the air. Dave turned back to us, his face pale in the flickering light. He didn't shout this time, but his voice was firm. "Everyone, back to your cabins. Now." We didn't argue. In seconds, the mood had shifted from fun and games to something much more serious. My friends and I scrambled up the hill toward the cabins, and you could feel the unease radiating off everyone. That night, instead of the usual pranks or pillow fights, we whispered late into the night about what had happened. Some thought it was a prank, others were convinced someone was drowning, but no one could explain why we hadn't seen anything on the lake. That night, counselors took shifts watching over each cabin. They sat outside with flashlights, scanning the woods and the water. Inside, we lay awake, listening for any more sounds, but the voice didn't return. The next morning, instead of the usual routine of cleaning up the camp and preparing for departure, we were woken up early by the sound of the camp bell. When our counselor came in, he had a strange, hurried look on his face. "Buses will be here in 20 minutes. Pack your stuff. We're leaving." We were stunned. Normally, the last day of camp was relaxed, filled with final goodbyes and wrapping things up. But now we were being rushed out without any explanation. We packed quickly, still rattled by the events of the previous night. The buses arrived earlier than scheduled, and just like that, we were heading home. Over the years, I've tried to find out what really happened that night. As the internet grew, I scoured articles, local archives, and camp forums looking for any sign of an accident or incident that might explain the mysterious voice on the lake. But I never found anything. There were no reports of drownings, no missing persons cases from that area, no clues at all. Strangely enough, the camp is still running to this day. I even joined an alumni Facebook group, and every once in a while, someone will bring up that final night in 1982. The posts are always cryptic, with people commenting things like, "I was there," or "I'll never forget it," but no one ever dives deep into what happened. It's like we all silently agreed to remember, but never to relive it. 4 decades later, the memory of that voice still sends a chill down my spine. Who or what was out there that night? We may never know, but for everyone who was there, it remains one of the most unsettling experiences of our lives. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.